party organizations made a significant contribution to our military mission. Especially praiseworthy were the chief of the political department of the Army Group, Pyotr Gorokov, Regimental Commissar Roman Babiachuk, Secretary of the Party Committee of the Special Corps, Alexei Pomogailo, and Commissar Ivan Zakhovorotny. Among the political officers of larger units, Regimental Commissar Vasily Saikov, Commissar of the 9th Motorized Brigade, figured especially prominently. In the past, he was a metal worker from the Urals. Saikov efficiently helped his commanding officer and often led his men in combat, inspiring them to feats of valor with his own courage. During the Patriotic War, when he was a member of the Military Council of an army, he carried out his duties with the same daring and courage as in those days. Days and nights, the medical personnel labored under the most difficult field conditions, saving the lives of our officers and men, and displaying a most humane attitude towards captured Japanese. I remember my meetings with Professor M.N. Akutin. Once I was told that the professor, though dead tired after performing many operations, had ordered that his blood be given to a wounded officer. I rang him to ask that blood be obtained from some younger doctor, but Akutin barked into the telephone, "I've no time to find the necessary blood group." He asked me not to detain him and gave his own blood after all. Professor Akutin devised and organized an efficient system for treating the wounded in stages. He extended much assistance to the medicos of the Fraternal Mongolian Army. Working from 15 to 18 hours daily, he found time to give further training to our young surgeons, and I do not think I will be far wrong in saying that those who worked with Professor Akutin learned a great deal from him about the art of surgery. It was Professor Akutin who supervised the early work of the young talented surgeon A. Vishnevsky. The Mongolian troops that fought in the Khalkhin Gol area cooperated well with the Soviet troops. A letter from the Mongolian soldiers to their Soviet mates had a moving effect on our men in the trenches. Dear brothers, men of the Red Army, we, the braves, commanders and political officers of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army operating in the Khalkhin Gol area, send you the warmest greetings in the name of the entire working people of Mongolia. You, the defenders of our land against the Japanese invaders, and we congratulate you on the successful encirclement and complete rout of the samurais who had stolen into our country. Our people will inscribe in golden letters, in the history of their struggle for freedom and independence, your heroic fight against the Japanese horde in the area of Khalkhin Gol. Were it not for your fraternal and selfless aid, we would not have had an independent, revolutionary Mongolian state. Were it not for the aid of the Soviet state, we would be faced with the same fate as the people of Manchuria. Japanese invaders would have overrun and plundered our land and our hard-working herdsmen. This has not happened and will never happen because we are being helped and saved from a Japanese invasion by the Soviet Union. Thank you, and many thanks to the Soviet people. The men of the Mongolian army admired the fighting skills of the Soviet troops, but we Soviet soldiers were equally delighted by the heroic exploits of the Mongolian troopers and their commanders. I personally witnessed the feats of valor performed by the Mongolian men and their commanding officers. In this connection, I would like to mention the names of some of them: Private Olzvoy, armored car driver Kayan Kave, anti-aircraft gunners Chultem and Gombosuren, and horseman Korlu. A great creative effort was made by the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army staff, headed by the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army, Corps Commissar Zhe Lekagvasuren. A monument has been erected to the fallen Khalkhin Gol heroes, bearing the following words: "Eternal glory to the heroic warriors of the Soviet Army and the brave men of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army, who fell in the battles against Japanese invaders in the area of the Khalkhin Gol, for the freedom and independence of the peace-loving Mongolian people, for peace and the security of nations, and against imperialist aggression." The Soviet government, in recognition of the merits of Soviet Army men in the clash with Japanese aggressors, conferred the title of Hero of the Soviet Union upon 70 of them. Pilots S.I. Gritsevets, Y.V. Smushkevich, and G.P. Kravchenko Each received a second gold medal of Hero of the Soviet Union. The title of Hero of the Soviet Union was also conferred upon me, and in 1972 I was conferred the title of Hero of the Mongolian People's Republic. After the termination of hostilities on the Khalkhin Gol, the command and headquarters of the army group returned to Ulaanbaatar, the capital of the Mongolian People's Republic, in late October 1939. What I had known about Mongolia before was gleaned from books and newspapers. Now I had the chance to see the country with my own eyes. It is especially pleasant for me to recall the sincerity of the Mongolian people, their kindness, and their trust in the Soviet Union. No matter where I was, in the homes of people, in state institutions, or in military barracks, everywhere I saw, in a place of honor, a picture of Lenin, of whom each Mongol I met spoke with heartfelt warmth and affection. Our men often visited our Mongolian friends, while the Mongolian comrades frequently attended our exercises, and we did our best to pass on to them the combat experience we had gathered in the recent fighting. Marshal Khorlogin Choibalsan enjoyed great authority and affection among the Mongolian people. I became very friendly with him when, in August 1939, he visited me at my command post on Kamar Darba Mountain. He was an extraordinary person of great warmth and charm, a devoted friend of the Soviet Union, and a real internationalist who devoted his life to the struggle against imperialism and fascism. The last time I saw him was during the Great Patriotic War, when he brought to the front gift parcels from the Mongolian people to the soldiers of the Red Army. We could see that Yumjagin Tsedenbal was held in high respect by his people. A well-educated and clever man, he had for many years worked with Choibalsan and other members of the Central Committee of the party. After Choibalsan's demise in 1952, Tsedenbal was made Prime Minister. Later, as First Secretary of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party and Chairman of the MPR Council of Ministers, he devoted all his strength, knowledge and energy to the building of socialism in his country and fought for the friendship of fraternal Marxist-Leninist parties and for peace, socialism and democracy all over the world. Running ahead of my narrative, I would like to note the assistance the Mongolian people rendered to the Soviet Union during the Patriotic War against Nazi Germany. In 1941 alone, the Mongolian People's Republic supplied 140 carloads of presents for Soviet soldiers, totaling 65 million tugriks. The USSR Bank for Foreign Trade received from Mongolia 2,500,000 tugriks, 100,000 US dollars, and 300 kilograms of gold. These funds paid for 53 tanks, including 32 T-34S, which were named after Suke Bator and other Mongolian national heroes. Many of these tanks successfully fought German troops and entered Berlin with the 112th Tank Brigade of the 1st Guards Tank Army. Besides tanks, the people of Mongolia paid for an air squadron, the Mongolian Herdsman, which was turned over to the Soviet Air Force and assigned to the 2nd Orsha Guards Air Regiment. It fought very well throughout the war. In 1941 to 1942, the Red Army received 35,000 horses as a gift from Mongolia for its cavalry. During the Patriotic War, delegations from the Mongolian People's Republic, headed by Choibalsan, Tsedenbal, and other Mongolian statesmen, frequently visited our army units, each visit adding to the fraternal friendship of the Soviet and Mongolian peoples. Great work during the military operations on the Khalkhin Gol was done by Tsedenbal and Soviet ambassador Aya Ivanov, thanks to whom our troops never experienced food shortages. Ever since then, Tsedenbal has been a close friend of the Soviet people, for whom he represents the friendly people of Mongolia advancing to socialism. Ambassador Ivanov, for his part, enjoyed the sincere respect of the Mongolian people, statesmen and party leaders, whom he had helped to the best of his ability. Our troops returned to their winter quarters and summed up what had been done on the battlefields. It was heartening to see how our officers and men had augmented their knowledge of military matters. The best officers and men were sent to those units that had not taken part in the actual fighting on the Khalkhin Gol to pass on the experience they had obtained in fighting the Japanese. fundamental changes were introduced in the political education of the troops. All that taken together yielded effective results, improving the combat readiness of our forces. It was not accidental that the units which had fought in Mongolia in 1939 and 1940 fought the Germans most effectively when moved to the Moscow area in 1941. In 1945, when, acting on its commitment to its allies of the anti-Hitler coalition, and also to remove the military danger presented by militarist Imperial Japan, which kept her million-strong Kwantung army poised against the MPR and the Soviet Far East, the Soviet government declared war on Japan. The fraternal Mongolian People's Republic did the same. The Mongolian army, led by the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party and personally by Choibalsan and Tsedenbal, operated on the right flank of the Soviet troops as a unit of the Soviet Mongolian Mechanized Cavalry Group under General Aya Pliyev. Our soldiers, commanders and political officers attest to the bravery and prowess of the Mongolian troops, which cooperated most skillfully, daringly and effectively with their Soviet friends. For his skilled generalship, Marshal of the MPR Choibalsan was decorated by the Soviet government with the Order of Suvorov First Class, while Tsedenbal, Deputy Commander-in-Chief and Chief of the Political Administration of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army, was decorated with the Order of Kutuzov First Class. 26 Mongolian officers and men were decorated with the Order of the Red Banner, 13 with the Order of Glory Third Class, and 82 with the Medal for Bravery. Altogether, the USSR Supreme Soviet decorated 302 Mongolians in 1945. Today, the Mongolian People's Republic is a prosperous socialist country. Its industry, agriculture, science and technology are making rapid headway. Considerable aid is being extended to it by the Soviet Union and other fraternal socialist countries. In peacetime, as in the war against foreign aggressors, the guiding role is played by the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party and its Central Committee. In early May 1940, I was ordered to report to the People's Commissariat for Defense for a new posting. By the time I arrived in Moscow, a government decree had been published conferring the ranks of general on the top commanders of the Red Army. Together with other comrades so honoured, I was conferred the rank of General of the Army. A few days later, I was received by J.V. Stalin and given the post of commander of the Kiev Special Military District. I had never met Stalin before and naturally looked forward to the audience with great excitement. In the room, besides Stalin, were Kalinin, Molotov, and other members of the political bureau. Stalin asked, lighting his pipe, "What do you think of the Japanese army?" "The Japanese soldiers who fought against us on the Khalkhin Gol are well trained, especially for fighting at close quarters," I answered. "They are obedient, diligent, and dogged in combat, especially in defence. Junior commanding officers are well trained and fanatically persistent. As a rule, they do not surrender and do not stop short of harakiri. Officers, especially senior officers and generals, are not adequately trained, lack initiative, and lean towards stereotype. As for the armaments of the Japanese army, my opinion is that they are obsolete. The Japanese tanks of the same type as our MS-1S are definitely outdated. They are slow, poorly armed, and have a very limited action radius. I must also say that at the beginning of the campaign, the Japanese Air Force was superior to ours. Their planes were better than ours until we received an improved version of the Chaika and the I-16. When the group of pilots headed by Y.V. Shmushkevich, all of them heroes of the Soviet Union, arrived, our air superiority was unquestionable. I should add that we had to deal with hand-picked so-called imperial units of the Japanese army. Stalin had listened very attentively, then asked, "How did our troops fight?" "Our regular troops fought very well. Especially good were the 36th Motorized Division under Petrov and the 57th Rifle Division under Galanin. The latter arrived from the Trans-Baikal Military District. The 82nd Rifle Division, which came from the Urals, was not good at first. It was formed of poorly trained officers and men. This division was deployed and reinforced with conscripts not long before its dispatch to Mongolia. The tank brigades, especially the 11th under hero of the Soviet Union Brigade Commander Yakovlev, did a very good job. I would like to point out, however, that the BT-5 and BT-7 tanks are too highly inflammable. If I had not had 2 tank and 3 motorized armoured brigades, we would not have been able to surround and defeat the 6th Japanese Army so quickly. I believe we should greatly increase the number of armoured and mechanized units in our armed forces. Our artillery was in all respects better than the Japanese, especially in fire precision. In general, our troops are much superior to the Japanese. The Mongolian troops, which were trained and supported by the Red Army, fought well, especially their armoured battalion in the Bain-Sagan mountain area. It should be said, too, that the Mongolian cavalry was sensitive to air attacks and artillery shelling and sustained heavy casualties. "What help did you get from Kulik, Pavlov and Voronov?" Stalin asked. Voronov helped well in planning the artillery fire and in organizing ammunition supplies. As for Kulik, I cannot say that he did anything useful. Pavlov helped our tankmen by sharing with them the experience he had gained in Spain. I watched Stalin closely while I was talking, and he seemed to be listening with interest. I continued, "For all our troops, commanders of formations and units, and for me personally, the battles on the Khalkhin Gol were a very useful school of combat. I think that the Japanese, too, will draw the right conclusions about the strength and ability of the Red Army." "Tell me what difficulties our troops encountered on the Khalkhin Gol," Kalinin intervened. "The main difficulties," I answered, "were connected with material and technical supplies. We had to transport everything that was vital for combat and survival over a distance of 650, 700 kilometers. The closest supply stations were in the Trans-Baikal military district. Even the firewood for cooking had to be brought from 600 kilometers away. The round trip made by lorries ran to 1,300, 1,400 kilometers. Hence, there was an unheard-of waste of petrol, which had also to be supplied from the Soviet Union. In overcoming these difficulties, we were greatly assisted by the Military Council of the Trans-Baikal Military District and Colonel General Stern with his personnel. Our troops suffered badly from mosquitoes, of which there is a teeming multitude on the Khalkhin Gol. At dusk, they simply ate us alive. The Japanese had special mosquito nets. We had none, and had them made after great delays. "What, in your opinion, was the main aim of the Japanese government in organizing the invasion?" Kalinin asked. "The immediate aim was to seize Mongolian territory beyond the Khalkhin Gol, and then build a fortified line along the river to defend the second railway track of strategic importance, to be built close to the boundary of our Trans-Baikal area, west of the Chinese Eastern Railway." "Now that you have combat experience," Stalin said, "take upon yourself the command of the Kiev military district and use this experience for training the troops." While I was in the Mongolian People's Republic, I had no chance of making a detailed study of the military operations between Germany and the Anglo-French bloc. I decided to use this opportunity to ask, how should one understand the extremely passive nature of the war in the West? And what turn might one expect the further events to take? Stalin chuckled and said, "The French government, headed by Daladier and the Chamberlain government in Britain, have no intention of getting seriously involved in the war with Hitler. They still hope to be able to persuade Hitler to start a war against the Soviet Union. They refused to form an anti-Hitler bloc with us in 1939 because they did not want to hamper Hitler in his aggression against the Soviet Union. But nothing will come of it. They will have to pay a high price for their short-sighted policy." After returning to the Moskva hotel where I was staying, I was a long time dropping off to sleep because I was mulling over this conversation. Stalin's appearance, his soft voice, the depth and concreteness of his judgment, his knowledge of military matters, and the attention with which he listened to my report, all this had impressed me deeply. I regarded it as a great honour to be put in charge of the biggest military district in the country, and did my utmost to prove worthy of the trust put in me by the Central Committee of the party and the government. The Kiev Special Military District was a first-rate military organisation. During my tour of duty with the Belarusian military district from 1922 to 1939, We Belarusians had always looked up to the troops of the Kiev district and had a very high opinion of their combat training and of the strategic and tactical proficiency of their field and staff officers. I was gratified to learn that I would be serving with experienced troop commanders and political officers. Many of them I knew personally, many I had heard about from other officers and generals, and with some I had worked together for years. The Chief of Staff of the Kiev Special Military District at the time was Lieutenant General M.A. I had worked with him in the Belarusian military district, where he had served as Chief of Staff. He was an experienced and highly knowledgeable general, and indeed a staff officer of the highest order. The district chief of artillery was General N.D. Yakovlev, an outstanding expert in guns and their uses in combat. 2 armies were under the command of generals in Muzichenko and F.R. Kostenko, with whom I had worked for a length of time in the 4th Don Cossack Division. The district chief of operations was Colonel P.N. Rubtsov, whom I knew from the days in the central offices of the People's Commissariat for Defense. Rubtsov was soon to be replaced by Colonel I.K. Bagramyan, whom I knew to be an extremely profound, cool-headed, diligent and competent officer. The district chief of supply turned out to be my old friend, V.Y. Belokoskov. I particularly want to put in a good word for the district chief of aviation, General E.S. Patukin, a brilliant airman and commanding officer, as well as a devoted son of our party and a considerate comrade. In a short time I got to know other ranking officers of the district equally well. Among them were highly skilled and well-educated men who performed their duties with great efficiency, punctuality and energy. Having familiarized myself with the affairs in the district, I thought I should introduce myself to the secretaries of the Ukrainian Communist Party's Central Committee. I gave them an account of the rout of the 6th Japanese Army on the Khalkhin Gol and described some of my first impressions, requesting their cooperation in meeting the district's needs. They turned out to be most amenable, and I was happy that everything was going so well. Throughout June 1940, I visited almost all the units and formations in the district. Then, together with the staff of district headquarters, we conducted a large-scale field tour with signal communications support to the Ternopil, Lvov, Vladimir, Volinsky, Dubno area, exactly where the Germans struck their main blow of Operation Barbarossa in Ukraine a year later in 1941. The exercise proved that the armies, formations and staffs were commanded by highly capable young officers and generals. True, since they had only recently been promoted from less important duties, they did need some serious operational and tactical training. This point was taken up by the higher echelons of command. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1940, the troops of the Kiev Special Military District were engaged in intense combat training. They were drawing on the tactical experience the Red Army had gained in the war against Finland and in the battles with the Japanese on the Khalkhin Gol. Due account was also taken of the combat experience of the Nazi troops against several European states. By that time, World War II was in full swing. At the end of 1936, Germany and Italy had concluded an agreement forming the notorious Berlin-Rome Axis, while Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, allegedly spearheaded against the Communist International. In actual fact, it united the aggressors in their drive for world supremacy. In 1937, Italy joined the pact. At the same time, Japan resumed the war to seize the whole of China. Austria ended its existence as an independent state in 1938. An armed attack on Czechoslovakia was in the offing. Appealing to peace-loving states, the Soviet government declared, "It may be late tomorrow, but today there is still time for all states, particularly the great powers, to take a firm and unambiguous stand on the collective salvation of peace." The Soviet proposals were not accepted. At the ill-famed conference in Munich, September 29-30, 1938, Britain and France agreed to Germany's annexing the Sudeten region in order to save peace at the last moment. The Czechoslovak delegation was waiting for the verdict on its country's future behind closed doors, while the USSR was debarred from the talks. We were prepared to come to the aid of Czechoslovakia. Our aviation and tanks were alerted. Up to 40 divisions were massed in regions adjacent to the western border. But the Czechoslovak rulers of that time declined this aid and preferred abject surrender. On March 15, 1939, Germany occupied Prague. This was a natural consequence of the appeasement of Hitler. Such a turn of affairs, repeatedly predicted by the Soviet Union, put Britain and France before the question of what they would do if Hitler, whom they had been pushing eastward, would come out against the West. There began another round of talks, meetings and conferences to scare Hitler with the prospect of a possible military alliance with the USSR. While demanding a Soviet commitment of assistance in case of German aggression, Daladier and Chamberlain did not wish to reciprocate by taking similar pledges themselves. The 1939 negotiations came to an impasse. The same can be said of the talks between the military missions of Britain, France, and the USSR. In short, the situation in Europe at that time was characterized by pressures on the part of Hitler and passivity on the part of Britain and France. The leaders of the capitalist states refused to support the numerous Soviet measures and proposals designed to create an effective collective security system. This was only natural. The prevailing situation was made complex, conflicting, and tragic by the desire of the British and French ruling circles to engineer a head-on clash between Germany and the USSR. While bombs had not yet begun to explode in their own home, the class interests of the long-standing allies in the struggle against the first socialist state boiled down to one and the same thing. They kept bowing to Hitler. Daladier and Chamberlain still believed they would manage to outsmart everyone, to slip away in good time from the Nazi war machine poised for action, and at the last moment to push it towards the Soviet Union. Even after Germany had attacked Poland on September 1, 1939, her allies, Britain and France having declared war on Germany, in fact did not lift a finger. Chief of Staff of the High Command Operations Department, Alfred Jodl, admitted at the Nuremberg trial, "If we did not collapse already in the year 1939, that was due only to the fact that during the Polish campaign, the approximately 110 French and British divisions in the West were held completely inactive against the 23 German divisions." The landowners' government of Poland had declined the assistance offered by the Soviet Union. It had sagaciously erected defense zones and fortifications in the east, preparing for war with the Soviet Union, while Hitler's troops moved in from the west, north, and south and swiftly seized the Polish munition depots. Despite the valiant struggle put up by Polish patriots, the German hordes closed in on the Polish army, which found itself in a kind of enormous kettle. How did the Red Army look in those troublous times? At the 18th Party Congress, March 1939, Marshal Voroshilov, People's Commissar for Defense, reported that compared with 1934, the army had more than doubled its strength, and its motorization had increased 260%. He cited summarized data relating to the firepower of a Soviet infantry corps, which were not below that of a corps in the German or French armies. The cavalry had grown by 50% and was considerably reinforced, 35% on average, with artillery, light and heavy machine guns and tanks. The tank pool had almost doubled, and its fire capacity almost quadrupled. The effective range and rate of fire of the artillery, particularly those of anti-tank and tank guns, had increased. If back in 1934 the entire air fleet could lift 2,000 tons of bombs in one sortie, the payload in 1939 showed a 208% increase. Fighters and even bombers could develop a speed of over 500 kilometers an hour. In reporting to the party's 18th Congress about the work of the Central Committee, J.V. Stalin commented on the threat of the new imperialist war. He said that our country, which constantly followed a policy of peace, was doing its utmost to enhance the fighting capacity of the Red Army and Navy. That was really so. It often happens, by the way, that most important documents are ignored by our historical researchers. Sometimes the thoughts and judgments on pre-war years obtained from indirect sources and through supplementary research sound like a revelation, while the same thoughts and even facts are contained in books easily available in libraries. For instance, The records of the party congresses of those years contain extensive historical data reflecting the tremendous work carried out by the party and people in all areas of life. As a matter of fact, such documents are generally compiled not by individuals, but by the hundreds and even thousands of specialists processing great quantities of data before providing a figure for a major report. Of course, speaking at the party's 18th Congress, the People's Commissar for Defense could not supply absolute figures describing the Army's capability. But concrete data were revealed at the talks of the military missions of the USSR, Britain and France in August 1939, which, of course, were held secret. These talks are of great interest. They vividly reflect the serious approach and the sense of responsibility displayed by the Soviet government in its bid to create a collective security system in Europe. They also show our earnest and realistic readiness to sacrifice a great deal for this end. The Soviet government directly instructed its military envoys to sign a military convention on questions of organizing a military defense of Britain, France, and the USSR against aggression in Europe. Britain and France, however, sent men of obscure rank to the negotiations with the sole aim of sounding out things and without a sincere interest in successful military cooperation. A secret letter of instructions to the British mission. The letter stated that the British government did not wish to assume any definite commitments that would tie its hands. The mission was instructed to conduct the talks at a slow rate and show reserve in its dealings with the Russians. Regarding a military agreement, the mission was told to confine itself to vague definitions. Below is an excerpt from the records of those times, which shows the combat capacity of the Soviet Army ready for deployment along our western frontiers. It also reveals the hostile designs of the Western powers, set on letting Hitler know that the British and French would not interfere if he marched east. Record of meeting of military missions of the USSR, Britain and France on August 15, 1939. Meeting began at 10:07, ended at 13:20. Army Commander B.M. Shaposhnikov. At the previous meetings, we examined a plan for the disposition of the French armies in the West. In keeping with the request of the military missions of Britain and France, and on instructions of the USSR military mission, I will now present the plan of deployment of the armed forces of the USSR on its western border. To counter aggression in Europe, the Red Army will deploy in the European part of the USSR and will dispose on the front 120 infantry divisions, 16 cavalry divisions, 5,000 heavy guns and howitzers, 9,000 to 10,000 tanks, 5,000 to 5,500 bomber and fighter aircraft, excluding Army cooperation aircraft. These figures do not include garrisons of fortified areas, air defence troops, coast guards, depot units, and base area troops. Without dwelling at length on the organisation of the Red Army, I can say briefly that an infantry division consists of 3 rifle and 2 artillery regiments. Its wartime strength is 19,000 men. A corps consists of 3 infantry divisions and has its own artillery, 2 regiments. Admiral Drax, addressing General Haywood, asked if any of the officers were writing down Army Commander Shaposhnikov's communication and received an affirmative reply. Armies of varied composition, from 5 to 8 corps each, have their own artillery, aviation and tanks. The garrisons of fortified areas can be brought to combat alert within 4 to 6 hours. The fortified areas stretch along the entire western frontier of the USSR, from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. An army can be concentrated within 8 to 20 days. The railway network not only permits the concentration of an army at the frontier within the indicated time, but also allows for modifications of this concentration along the whole front. Along the western frontier, we have 3 to 5 lateral lines of communication to a depth of 300 kilometres. At present, we have a sufficient number of powerful steam engines and large freight cars, which have twice the capacity we had before. Our trains carry loads that are twice as heavy as they were, and the speed of the trains has been increased. We have a sizable pool of lorries and cars and lateral roads that make it possible to deploy troops by motor vehicles along the whole length of the front. Now, I will present 3 alternative plans approved by the USSR military mission for possible joint action by the armed forces of Britain, France, and the USSR in case of aggression in Europe. The first alternative is intended if the aggressor bloc attacks Britain and France. In that case, the USSR will engage the equivalent of 70% of the armed forces directly engaged by Britain and France against the chief aggressor, Germany. Let me explain. For instance, if France and Britain deploy against Germany 90 infantry divisions, the USSR will deploy 63 infantry divisions and 6 cavalry divisions with a corresponding force of artillery, tanks and aircraft, in round figures about 2 million men. The Northern Fleet of the USSR, together with an Anglo-French squadron, will cruise along the coasts of Finland and Norway outside their territorial waters. The USSR Baltic Fleet can extend its cruiser operations and submarine actions and lay mines off the shores of East Prussia and Pomerania. Our submarines will prevent the shipment of industrial raw materials from Sweden to the chief aggressor. As Army Commander B.M. Shaposhnikov reports on the plan of action, Admiral Drax and General Haywood plot the situation on their sketch maps. The second alternative plan is intended if the aggression is directed against Poland and Romania. The Soviet Union can participate in the war only if France and Britain arrange with Poland and, if possible, Lithuania, as well as Romania, to let Soviet troops pass through the Vilna Gap, in Galicia and in Romania, and to permit operations in that area. In that case, the USSR commits the equivalent of 100% of the armed forces committed by Britain and France directly against Germany. For instance, if France and Britain commit against Germany 90 infantry divisions, the USSR will likewise commit 90 infantry divisions and 12 cavalry divisions with corresponding artillery, aviation, and tanks. The tasks of the British and French fleets remain the same as in the first alternative. In the south, the Black Sea Fleet of the USSR, having closed the mouth of the Danube against the exit of submarines and other naval forces of the aggressors, will close the Bosporus to stop the entry of hostile surface vessels and submarines into the Black Sea. The third alternative plan provides for a situation in which the chief aggressor, using the territory of Finland, Estonia and Latvia, directs his attacks against the USSR. In this case, France and Britain should immediately enter the war against the aggressor or bloc of aggressors. Poland, bound by agreements with Britain and France, must enter the war against Germany and grant rights of passage to Soviet troops through the Vilna Gap and into Galicia, in keeping with the British and French government's understanding with the Polish government. As mentioned above, the USSR deploys 120 infantry divisions, 16 cavalry divisions, 5,000 heavy guns and howitzers, 9,000 to 10,000 tanks, and 5,000 to 5,500 aircraft. France and Britain should, in this case, engage the equivalent of 70% of the above-mentioned Soviet force and immediately begin active operations against the chief aggressor. The Anglo-French fleets should operate as indicated in the first alternative plan. Record of meeting of military missions of the USSR, Britain and France on August 17, 1939. Meeting began at 10:07. Ended at 13:43. Marshal K. Yer Voroshilov presiding. I declare the meeting of the military missions open. Today we have before us a statement on the Soviet Air Force. If there are no questions, I will give the floor to Army Commander 2nd Class Loktionov, Air Force Chief of the Red Army. Army Commander A.D. Loktionov, Army Commander 1st Class Shaposhnikov, Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army, said in his report here that in the West European theatre, the Red Army would deploy 5,000 to 5,500 combat planes. This number represents first-line aviation and does not include reserves. Out of this figure, 80% are modern aircraft with the following velocities: fighters, 465 to 575 km per hour and more; bombers, 460 to 550 km per hour. The range of bombers is 1,800 to 4,000 km, and the bomb load ranges from 600 kg for old models to 2,500 kg. The ratio of bombers to fighters and army aviation is bombers, 55% fighters, 40% army, 5%. Soviet aircraft plants are operating on a one-shift schedule at present, with only a few on a two-shift schedule. They turn out an average of 900 to 950 combat aircraft monthly, not counting civil and training aircraft. In view of the increasing aggression in Europe and in the East, our aircraft industry has taken steps to expand its output to the limit that will meet the needs of war. The main air units can be alerted within 1 to 4 hours. Duty units are on constant ground alert. In the opening stage of hostilities, Air Force operations will correspond to plans worked out by the General Staff. The general principle of Air Force actions is determined by the need to concentrate all forces, ground and air, in the direction of the main effort. Consequently, the Air Force operates in close conjunction with ground forces in the battlefield and throughout the operational depth. The bombers will attack enemy manpower and major military objectives. Additionally, bombers will hit military targets in the deep enemy rear. Soviet aviation never sets itself the aim of bombing civilians. Apart from protecting major military objectives, rail and motor roads, fighters have the tasks of covering the concentration of ground troops and aviation, defending cities in close conjunction with other anti-aircraft defense facilities, engaging enemy aircraft, and securing the operation of bombers and attack aircraft on the battlefield in close cooperation with them. Marshal Bernet. On behalf of the French and British missions, I would like to thank General Loktionov for his accurate report. I am greatly impressed by the energy and organized manner that enabled the Soviet Union to achieve such outstanding results in creating its aviation. Historians and writers of memoirs are fond of asking, what would have happened if? Indeed, if the governments of Britain and France had agreed to join hands with the Soviet Union against the aggressor in 1939, as we suggested, the destiny of Europe would have been different. The Politburo meeting of March 1940 was of great importance for the further development of our armed forces. It reviewed the results of the war with Finland. Discussions were sharp. The system of combat training and education was strongly criticized. The question was raised of considerably increasing the fighting capacity of the Army and Navy. An enlarged conference of the Chief Military Council was convened on the recommendation of the Politburo in mid-April 1940. Veterans of the war with Finland and ranking officers of the Central, District and Army commands were invited to attend. The conference helped to define the basic principles of organizing combat training to suit the existing situation. The party's Central Committee and the government instructed a special commission headed by A. Zhdanov and N. A. Voznesensky to inspect the work of the People's Commissariat for Defense. The commission demanded that the central military establishment put in more effort to strengthen the Army, Air Force and Navy. Based on the instructions of the party's Central Committee and the recommendations of the Chief Military Council, the People's Commissar for Defense issued a specific order on combat and political training of troops during the summer of 1940. What was the essence of the requirements that our party and government set for the armed forces in the middle of 1940? Taking into account the results of the Soviet-Finnish conflict, and particularly the nature of the combat operations in the already ongoing World War, the urgent and far-reaching task was set for the troops to learn today what they would need in war tomorrow. A reorganization began of all services and arms. Important measures were taken to back up one-man leadership and to tighten order and discipline in the army. By order of the People's Commissar for Defense, commanders and chiefs at all levels, as well as staffs, were required to align the system of combat training and education with what the war would require of the troops. Training of the troops was to be brought closer to combat situations. Personnel were to be trained to cope with lengthy physical strain. Tactical drills were to be held by day and night, in any weather, to be able to profit from the element of surprise and always be in a state of combat readiness. The order required infantry commanders to study and know the possibilities and specificity of the other arms in order to maintain close cooperation with them in all types of modern warfare. All through that summer, member of the District Military Council Vladimir Borisov and I were in the field with officers of the Combat Training and Operations Divisions. Major attention was devoted to the field training of commanding officers, staffs and troops of all arms of the service. Appointed People's Commissar for Defense on May 8, 1940, Timoshenko came to the district to inspect the troops in September. From September 22 to 24, there was a tactical review of the 41st Rifle Division in the area of Rava-Ruskaya. It was a two-sided field exercise with Air Force participation. The 41st Division's artillery made a particularly good showing. From September 25 to 27, review exercises were also held in the 99th Division. The division came up with excellent results and was awarded a Red Banner. The division's artillery won the challenge Red Banner of the Red Army Artillery. From September 27 to October 4, field exercises were held for the staffs of the 37th Rifle Corps, the 6th Rifle Corps, the 36th Tank Brigade, and the 97th Rifle Division. The staffs were well organized and displayed good initiatives, providing the field command with the opportunity to exercise continuous control of the troops in complicated and swiftly changing situations. For its excellent results, the staff of the 37th Rifle Corps was awarded the challenge Red Banner of the Red Army's General Staff, while Corps Commander Kondrusev and Chief of Staff Mendrov were presented with gold watches. Special gifts were made to many officers. Less than a year later, the 37th Rifle Corps, like the 41st, 99th, and 97th Rifle Divisions, had to come to grips with crack Nazi troops. The officers and men of all units displayed great courage during those first and most arduous days of the war. It should be pointed out that review exercises in the presence of high-ranking military commanders were immensely instructive and had a powerful mobilizing effect. S.K. Timoshenko was very well versed in the combat training of individual soldiers and units, both big and small. Indeed, it was something he enjoyed very much. With his appointment as People's Commissar for Defense, battle training was put on the right lines. The prime objective, as called for by the party, was to teach officers and men all that they would need in actual war. We began to devote particular attention to reconnaissance and effective use of terrain in both offensive and defensive operations. We would tirelessly impress upon officers and men the idea that a unit could be a formidable fighting force only if its entire personnel was well trained. I have feelings of respect for the district's political propaganda department chief, Divisional Commissar Yefim Pozhidayev, who made a very useful contribution to the education of the troops. I have described but one review conducted by Commissar for Defense Timoshenko in the district. Actually, many such exercises were held by the district command throughout 1940, and it is therefore no accident that in the first days of the war the troops of the Southwestern Front fought skillfully and bravely, delivering some very telling blows to the enemy. Towards the end of September 1940, the General Staff notified us that a conference of the top echelons of the Army Command would be held on the instructions of the Central Committee of the Party in December in Moscow. I was to prepare to speak on the nature of modern offensive operations. A large-scale strategic war game was also planned, and I was supposed to play for the blue side. The Commissar for Defense ordered me to present the draft of my report by November 1st. Owing to the complexity of my topic and the extremely high level of the conference, I spent a whole month working on the report many hours a day. Valuable assistance was rendered to me by the District Chief of Operations, Ivan Bagramyan. By the appointed time, the draft was presented to the People's Commissar. A couple of weeks later, Chief of General Staff K.A. Meretskov phoned to tell me that the draft had been approved by my superiors and that I should therefore stand by to deliver the report. The conference was held in late December 1940. It was attended by the commanding officers of districts and armies, members of military councils, and chiefs of staff of districts and armies, commanding officers of all military academies, professors and doctors of military science, inspectors of all arms, chiefs of central departments, and ranking officers of the General Staff. Throughout its deliberations, the conference was also attended by members of the party's Politburo. The conference heard several important reports. Army General IV Tyulenev prepared a comprehensive report on the nature of modern defence, but in keeping with instructions, he did not transcend the limits of defence on an army scale, and therefore did not discuss the nature of modern strategic defence. A report entitled "The Air Force in an Offensive and in the Fight for Air Control" was made by Air Force Commander Lieutenant General P.V. Rychagov, who had distinguished himself in Spain. It was an exceedingly profound paper. Lieutenant General A.K. Smirnov's report was entitled "A Rifle Division on the Offensive and on the Defensive." A general report on the combat and operational training of Red Army troops was made by Chief of General Staff General of the Army K.A. Meretskov. He took special note of the inadequate training standards of senior commanding officers and staffs of all levels. This was the aftermath of the mass promotion to ranking commands of young officers who were still insufficiently proficient in tactical, operational, and staff work. Universal interest was aroused by the report of Colonel General D.G. Pavlov, commander of the Western Special Military District, on the employment of mechanized formations in a modern offensive. That was a new and most important topic. In his well-argued paper, Pavlov skillfully revealed the high mobility and battering force of tank and mechanized units, as well as their lesser vulnerability in the face of enemy artillery and airstrikes as compared to other arms of the service. My paper on the nature of modern offensive operations was also favourably received. The audience made several valuable observations and some critical remarks. All who took part in the debate and the People's Commissar for Defence, who summed it up, were of the opinion that if a war was unleashed against the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany, we would have to deal with the most powerful army in the West. The conference emphasized that the German army had many armored and mechanized troops and a formidable air force, and that its generals had had much first-hand experience in organizing and conducting modern warfare. All who spoke at the conference acknowledged the vital and urgent need for us to continue forming tank and mechanized forces on the division and corps scale to equal the strength of the German army. There was much discussion about reorganizing and rearming the air force, as well as the anti-aircraft and anti-tank troops, and about the need to switch artillery to mechanized traction to heighten its mobility and cross-country ability. Overall, the conference showed that Soviet military thinking had essentially identified the chief trends in modern warfare. Now it had all to be translated into army combat practice as quickly as possible. After a while, based on the conclusions of the conference, further measures were taken to boost the combat readiness of frontier troops and improve staff performance. In the military districts, there was another round of large-scale strategic operational maneuvers and drills. A plan for protecting state borders was being worked out, and organizational standards for troops were being raised. The day after the conference, we were supposed to have a large-scale war game, but unexpectedly we were summoned by Stalin. He received us rather coldly, greeted us with a faint nod, and motioned for us to seat ourselves around the table. He reprimanded Timoshenko for closing the conference without having inquired about his opinion concerning the closing remarks. Timoshenko replied that he had sent him the draft and thought he had familiarized himself with it and had no comments. "When is your war game due to start?" Stalin inquired. "Tomorrow morning," said Timoshenko. "Very well, go ahead with it. But afterwards don't dismiss the field commanders." "Who is playing for the blue side, and who for the red?" continued Stalin. "General of the army Zhukov is playing for the blue, western side, and Colonel General Pavlov for the red, eastern side." The next morning, we commenced our large-scale war game. The strategic situation was based on probable developments in the western frontier zone in the event of a German attack on the Soviet Union. The game was conducted under the general control of Commissar for Defence S.K. Timoshenko and Chief of General Staff K.A. Meretskov. They also participated in the action in the southwestern strategic direction. The blue side, the Germans, was assumed to be the attacker, while the red side, the Red Army, was the defender. Basically, the strategic war game aimed to check the practicability and expediency of the main provisions laid down in the plan for cover and action by the troops in the initial period of the war. Credit is due to our General Staff for its effort. All the material it had prepared for the game largely reflected the latest operations of the Nazi troops in Europe. In the western strategic direction, the game embraced a front running from East Prussia to Polsey. The general composition of the front was as follows: Western, blue side, over 60 divisions; Eastern, red side, over 50 divisions. The land forces were given powerful air support. The game abounded in dramatic situations for the eastern side, which proved to be in many ways similar to what really happened after June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union. After the game was over, the People's Commissar for Defense ordered the commanding officers of both sides, Pavlov and myself, to make a partial analysis and indicate both the shortcomings and the positive aspects in the actions of the participants. A general summing up and analysis had been ordered by Stalin to be held in the Kremlin in the presence of top-ranking officials of the Commissariat for Defense and the General Staff, the district commanders and their chiefs of staff, Stalin and other Politburo members. The progress of the game was reported by General of the Army K.A. Meretskov, Chief of General Staff. When he cited figures on the balance of forces of the two sides and on the superiority of the Blues in the initial period, particularly in tanks and aircraft, Stalin, obviously irked by the poor showing of the Reds, cut him short and said, "Don't forget that it's not only the arithmetical majority, but the skill of commanders and troops that matters in battle." After several more remarks, Stalin asked, "Has anyone anything to say?" People's Commissar Timoshenko spoke. He emphasized the growing operational and tactical progress of the commanding officers and chiefs of staff of military districts and the unquestionable usefulness of the recently concluded conference and war game. In 1941, Timoshenko pointed out, the troops would have possibilities to train still more purposefully and with better organization, since by that time they would have settled down in their newly appointed locations. Colonel General Pavlov spoke next. He started out by evaluating the conference. "What are the causes of the unsuccessful actions of the Red side?" Stalin asked. Pavlov tried to get off with a joke, saying that these things happen in war games. Stalin was not amused. The officer commanding a district must be an expert and must find correct solutions in any conditions, which is what you failed to do in this game. Then Stalin asked again, "Does somebody else wish to speak?" I asked for the floor. Noting the considerable value of such games for raising the strategic and operational skills of high-ranking commanders, I suggested they should be held more often despite the difficulty of organizing them. To improve the competence of district commanders, their staff officers and army commanders, I suggested holding periodic command and staff field exercises with the employment of communications facilities under the general guidance of the Commissar for Defense and the General Staff. I then referred to the construction of fortified areas in Byelorussia. In my view, fortified zones in Byelorussia are being built too close to the frontier and have an extremely disadvantageous operational configuration, particularly in the area of the Belostok Bulge. This will enable enemy forces to strike from the Brest and Suwalki area at the rear of our Belostok group. Furthermore, due to inadequate depth, the fortified zones cannot expect to hold out for long as they are completely vulnerable to artillery fire. I hold that the fortified zones should be built farther from the border. Are the fortified zones correctly sited in the Ukraine, then? Asked Pavlov, evidently annoyed by my criticism of his district. I was not the one who located the fortified zones in the Ukraine, but I do think that there too they should be farther away from the border. Fortified zones are built according to the approved plans of the Chief Military Council, and the actual control over their construction is in the hands of Deputy Defense Commissar Marshal Shaposhnikov, K. Voroshilov objected crisply. Seeing that an argument was about to break out, I stopped short and sat down. A few other generals spoke on a number of controversial issues. Some very pertinent comments were offered by the Air Force Commander-in-Chief, General P.V. Rychagov. He insisted on the need for urgent introduction in our Air Force of the latest types of aircraft and felt it was essential to improve pilots' combat training. A strange impression was made by the remarks of Deputy Defense Commissar for Armaments, Marshal G.I. Kulik. He suggested increasing the strength of a regular rifle division to 16,000, 18,000 men, and advocated developing horse-drawn artillery. Addressing himself to the experience in Spain, he concluded that tank units should act mainly as direct support for the infantry and solely on a company and battalion scale. For the time being, continued Kulik, we should refrain from forming tank and mechanized corps. At this point, People's Commissar for Defense Timoshenko broke in to remark, "The Army Command is fully aware of the need for the prompt mechanization of the armed forces. Kulik is the only man who is still confused in these matters." Stalin ended the discussion with a comment on Kulik's obsolete views. "Victory in war," he pointed out, "will be won by the side that has more tanks and more highly motorized troops." The following day, I was summoned by Stalin. After a word of greeting, Stalin said, "The Politburo has decided to relieve Meretskov of the duties of Chief of General Staff and to appoint you in his place." I had been expecting anything but this and did not know what to say. Then I replied, "I have never been on any staff before. I have always been in the field. I cannot be Chief of General Staff." "The Politburo has decided to appoint you," Stalin said, laying special emphasis on the word decided. Seeing that objections were pointless, I offered my thanks for the trust placed in me and added, "But if I don't make a good Chief of General Staff, I shall ask to be transferred back to the field." "That's a deal. The Central Committee's decision will be issued tomorrow," Stalin concluded. A quarter of an hour later, I was in the Defense Commissar's office. Smiling broadly, he told me, "I know how you tried to refuse the post of Chief of General Staff. I just had a phone call from Stalin. You may return to your district now, but come back to Moscow as soon as possible. You will be replaced as commander of the district by Colonel General M.P. Kirponos. But don't wait till he comes. You can leave District Chief of Staff Pakayev to look after things for the time being." I had never served with Mikhail Kirponos, but judging by what those who had said of him, he was a highly experienced army general who had served in the old pre-revolutionary army. During the February Revolution of 1917, he had been elected chairman of the Regimental Soldiers Committee. In May 1918, he joined the party. From 1934 to 1939, he had been chief of the Kazan Rifle School. For meritorious service as commander of the 70th Infantry Division in action, he had been conferred the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. In June 1940, Kirponos was appointed commander of the Leningrad Military District. I was pleased that the Kiev Special Military District was entrusted to such a worthy commander. Naturally, like many others, he still lacked the knowledge and experience essential to command such a big frontier district. But nonetheless, his past experience, industriousness, and resourcefulness were a guarantee that Kirponos would be a first-class field commander. I left for Kiev the same night, to be back in Moscow as soon as possible. To be frank, I was leaving with a heavy heart. I had always liked Ukraine and the beautiful old city of Kiev. The Ukrainian people had given me their trust and had honored me by electing me to the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine and the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. The Ukrainian Party's Central Committee had given vigorous assistance to the troops of the district in organizing our field training and instruction, and saw to the welfare of the troops. During my brief tour of duty as district commander, I had come to know and to admire the diligence and initiative of the district command, particularly I, K.H. Bagramyan, E.S. Ptukin, N.D. Yakovlev, and the army, corps, and divisional commanders. I had profound trust in these men, and felt that if the hour of battle should strike, they could well be relied upon. And later events proved that I was not mistaken. I had many phone calls from the People's Commissar for Defense, urging me to wind up my affairs in the district more expeditiously. I did not stay long in Kiev. On January 31st, I was already in Moscow. The day after, having taken over K.A. Meretskov's duties, I became Chief of General Staff. All through February, I was busy studying matters directly relating to the General Staff. I worked 15 or 16 hours a day, often sleeping in my office. I cannot say that I managed overnight to become familiar with the many-sided activity of the General Staff. It came to me gradually, I was greatly assisted by N.F. Vatutin, G.K. Malandin, A.M. Vasilevsky, V.D. Ivanov, A.I. Shimonayev, N.I. Chetverikov, and other members of the General Staff. What had we achieved by the beginning of the war? Was the country, its armed forces, ready to stand up to the enemy? An exhaustive answer to that major question, with due account for its political, economic, military, and social aspects, and all objective and subjective factors, requires extensive research. I am sure that our historians will handle the task well. For my part, I am ready to speak primarily on the military side of the matter, reconstructing as best as I can the general state of affairs and outlining the events in those trying days and months of the first half of 1941. Let's take first things first. The economy and industry, which is the basis of the country's defensive capability. The third five-year plan, 1938 to 1942, was a logical follow-up of the first and second plans. The first two plans were more than fulfilled. Speaking of industrial output, it doubled after 4 years of the first five-year plan, while the increase of 110% envisaged for the second five-year plan period actually came to 120%. Then the 18th Congress of the Communist Party set the industrial increase for the next 5 years at 90%. Were there grounds to consider that target unrealistic? None whatsoever. By June 1941, gross industrial output was 86%, and rail freight turnover 90% of the level planned for the end of 1942. Some 2,900 factories, power stations, mines, and other industrial enterprises had been built and started up. Under the third five-year plan, capital investments in building new and modernizing old enterprises came to 182,000 million rubles, whereas similar investments during the first five-year plan period were 39,000 million and 103,000 million during the second. It follows, with due account of the increased construction costs in the past few years, that more production capacities were being put into operation than had been commissioned during the first and second five-year plan periods combined. And how were things with heavy industry, and in particular with the defense industry? The report to the 18th Congress of the Communist Party on the next plan of economic development stressed that when carrying out the previous plans, substantial changes had to be made in targets for heavy industry because of the deterioration of the world situation. For one, the envisaged rate of growth for the defense industry had to be stepped up considerably. Under the third five-year plan, heavy and defense industries continued rapid advance. While total industrial output grew by an average of 13%, that of the defense industry increased by 39%. A number of engineering and other large plants were converted for the production of defense equipment. Construction was underway of large specialized munition plants. The party's Central Committee assisted enterprises producing new weaponry for the armed forces to obtain raw materials that were in short supply and the latest equipment. Experienced party workers and prominent experts were assigned to the larger defense enterprises as CC party organizers to help the plants get everything they needed and to ensure attainment of targets. I must say that Stalin himself worked much with defense enterprises. He was personally acquainted with dozens of plant directors, party organizers, and chief engineers. He met with them, demanding fulfillment of plans with his typical persistence. Thus, we had a steady and rapid, I would even say all-out growth of the defense industry. One should remember, however, that this giant growth was largely attained, in the first place, through the exceptionally hard work of the masses, and, in the second, through the growth of light industry and other industries directly concerned with supplying people with foodstuffs and manufactured goods. It is equally important to remember that the growth of the heavy and defense industries was taking place in a peacetime economy of a peaceful, not militarized, state. Therefore, greater emphasis on that aspect would actually have meant passing from peaceful to military development, leading to a degeneration of the very nature of the national economy, its militarization to the detriment of the working people's interests. Naturally, from the vantage point of post-war, it is easy to say that we should have relied more on this or that type of weapon and less on another. But even so, one cannot say that some cardinal nationwide economic changes had been necessary before the war. I can even go farther. Recalling what we military leaders had demanded of industry in the last few months of peace, I can see that we did not always take full stock of the country's economic possibilities. Although perhaps from our departmental point of view, so to say, we were right. For instance, there were objective factors limiting the proposals of the People's Commissar for Defence for increasing the mass production of the latest types of aircraft, tanks, artillery tractors, lorries, and communications and other equipment. Of course, in industry and defence production, there had been many shortcomings and difficulties, which I will mention later. The tremendous scope of construction caused a shortage of skilled labour. Experience was wanting in the mass production of new types of weapons, while the demand for arms and equipment was growing from day to day. The procedure of adopting new types of weaponry for mass production was as follows. First, models underwent factory tests in the presence of army representatives. Then, service tests followed. Only after that, the People's Commissariat for Defence passed judgment. Then the government, along with the Commissar for Defence, the commissars of the defence industries, and the chief designers, considered the new models and made a final decision. All that was time-consuming. Sometimes a new weapon was being manufactured and tested when designers came up with a still better model, and, quite logically, the adoption of the earlier model was put off until the latest one was properly tested. On the whole, the tremendous production capacities built during the two pre-war 5-year periods, and especially in the 3 years preceding the war, provided a sound basis for the country's defence capability. Highly important from the military standpoint was the party line for accelerated industrial development of the eastern regions and the creation of backup enterprises for the engineering, oil refining and chemical industries. Under construction in the east were 3/4 of the total number of new blast furnaces, a second large oil base between the Volga and the Urals, iron and steel plants in the Urals, beyond Lake Baikal and on the Amur, major enterprises of the non-ferrous metals industry in Central Asia, and auto-assembly works, large aluminium plants, rolling mills, and hydropower stations in the Soviet Far East. During the war, having absorbed enterprises evacuated from the West, the eastern regions formed the industrial base for repulsing and defeating the enemy. I should like to say a few words about the material reserves amassed on the eve of the war to ensure the re-gearing of the economy along military lines and supplying troops with provisions until the economy began meeting war needs. Between 1940 and June 1941, the national material reserves grew in terms of value from 4,000 million rubles to 600 million rubles. These reserves included plant, fuel, raw materials, power, ferrous and non-ferrous metals, and foodstuffs. Although rather modest, these reserves accumulated on the eve of the war helped the national economy to build up the rate and scope necessary for successful prosecution of the war, despite the hardships of 1941. The heart of heavy industry and the defence industry beat quickly. In the years and months before the war, their development was intense and fast. Life in the country as a whole was becoming more orderly, as it were. The fourth extraordinary session of the USSR Supreme Soviet in September 1939 passed the law on universal military service. Now all persons of 19 and over were conscripted for service in the armed forces. For persons who had finished secondary school, the call-up age was set at 18. To give better military training, the term of active service was increased. For junior commanders of the infantry and air force from 2 years to 3. For all men in the Air Force, as well as for men and junior commanders in the Border Guards, to 4 years, for men on ships and other naval units, to 5 years. Fulfillment of the third 5-year plan as a whole, and reaching the heavy industry and defence industry targets in particular, like the threat of an armed assault on the USSR, called for more working time to be put into the country's economic development. Therefore, on June 26, 1940, the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet issued a decree putting the country on an 8-hour workday and a 6-day working week, and forbade industrial and office workers to give up their jobs without official permission. A new system of training skilled labour was introduced in vocational schools, railwaymen's schools, and factory schools. These schools trained from 800,000 to 1 million persons a year. Also, in the middle of 1940, the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet published a decree on responsibility for defective industrial output and for industrial enterprises deviating from established standards. Strict measures were introduced to improve management of enterprises, tighten discipline, and heighten responsibility and order. The state machinery and industrial management, too, underwent profound changes, becoming more flexible, less cumbersome, and less centralized. The People's Commissariat of the defense industry was broken down into 4 commissariats: of the aircraft industry, the shipbuilding industry, ammunition, and armaments. The People's Commissariat of Engineering was divided into commissariats of heavy, medium, and general engineering. New People's Commissariats were established, of motor transport, construction, etc., which directly contributed to strengthening the country's defences. The Economic Council of the USSR Council of People's Commissars was restructured into economic councils for the defence industry, iron and steel, fuel, engineering, and other industries. Prominent statesmen were appointed chairmen of these councils, including Deputy Chairman of the USSR Council of People's Commissars N.A. Voznesensky and Kosygin, and V.A. Malishev. All these changes were necessitated by the immensely increased amount of work and the preparations for active defence against aggression, whose likelihood increased from month to month. In the obtaining situation, and because of the new law on universal military service, the central military establishment and the local military agencies were also reorganized. Military commissariats were established in the autonomous republics, territories, and regions, and new regulations were issued to govern their functions. Cardinal questions were considered at the People's Commissariat for Defence by the Red Army's Chief Military Council. The Commissar for Defence was its chairman, and his deputies and a member of the Politburo of the party's Central Committee were its members. Especially important problems were usually considered in the presence of Stalin and other members of the Central Committee's Politburo. The Central Committee and the government specified the distribution of responsibilities within the USSR People's Commissariat for Defence in a decision dated March 8, 1941. Guidance of the Red Army was by the Commissar for Defence through the General Staff, his deputies, and a system of chief and central divisions. He was also directly in charge of the Chief Motor Armour Division, the Administrative Department, the Finance Division, the Personnel Division, and the Design Bureau. Prior to the war, responsibilities within the People's Commissariat for Defence were distributed as follows: the Communications Division, Fuel Supply Division, Chief Division of Air Defence, the Academy of the General Staff, and the M.V. Frunze Academy. General of the Army G.K. Zhukov, Deputy People's Commissar and Chief of General Staff. The Chief Supplies Division, Medical and Veterinary Divisions, and the Material Stocks Department, Marshal of the Soviet Union S.M. Budeny, First Deputy People's Commissar for Defence. The Chief Artillery Division, Chemical Defence Division, and the Artillery Academy, Marshal of the Soviet Union G.I. Kulik, Deputy Defence Commissar for Artillery. The Chief Division of Military Engineering and the Division for the Construction of Fortified Areas, Marshal of the Soviet Union B.M. Shaposhnikov, Deputy People's Commissar. Inspectorates of all arms and services, Division of Military Educational Establishments and Combat Training of the Red Army, General of the Army K.A. Meretskov, Deputy Defence Commissar for Combat Training. Chief Air Force Division, Air Force Lieutenant General P.V. Rychagov, Deputy People's Commissar. Chief Political Propaganda Division, Cultural and Educational Establishments and Publishing Houses of the Red Army, the 6th Lenin Military Political Academy, Military Law Academy, and Military Political Schools. Army Commissar First Class A.I. Zaporozhets, Deputy People's Commissar. The Red Army General Staff was successively headed by A.I. Yegorov from 1931, Marshal of the Soviet Union B.M. Shaposhnikov from 1937, and General of the Army K.A. Meretskov from August 1940 to February 1941. Now let's see what our armed forces were like on the eve of the war. For the reader's convenience and to facilitate conclusions, the narrative will be arranged in the following pattern: what had already been done by the people, party, and government, what we intended to accomplish in the immediate future, and what we did not have time to do or did not succeed in doing. Of course, in general terms only, with only a small quantity of facts. Infantry. In April 1941, the infantry was brought up to wartime strength. An infantry or rifle division, the main all-arms unit of the Red Army, comprised 3 infantry and 2 artillery regiments, 1 anti-tank and 1 anti-aircraft artillery battalion, reconnaissance and an engineer battalion, a signals battalion, logistical and other rear units and establishments. At wartime strength, an infantry, rifle division, was supposed to have about 14,500 officers and men, 78 field guns, 54 45mm anti-tank guns, 12 anti-aircraft guns, 66 82 120mm mortars, 16 light tanks, 13 armoured cars, and over 3,000 horses. So manned and equipped, the infantry divisions were sufficiently mobile and formidable fighting units. In 1939, 1940, and the first 6 months of 1941, the troops were supplied with over 105,000 light, mounted, and large-caliber machine guns, as well as over 100,000 submachine guns. This was achieved despite a slight drop in the output of small arms and artillery pieces due to winding up the production of outdated types of arms. New types could not be put into batch production quickly due to their complexity and peculiarities of design. In mid-March 1941, S.K. Timoshenko and I requested Stalin's permission to call up inductable reserve personnel to update their military training in infantry divisions. Initially, our request was declined, with the reasoning that calling up reservists on such a scale might give the Germans an excuse to provoke a war. However, by the end of March, we were permitted to call up 500,000 men and non-coms and send them to border military districts to augment infantry divisions, increasing the strength of each to at least 8,000. To summarize, an additional 300,000 men were called up a few days later to man the fortified areas with specialists and to augment other arms and services, including the High Command Reserve Artillery, engineers, signals, air defences, and Air Force logistical services. In total, the Red Army received nearly 800,000 additional men on the eve of the war, with their training planned for May to October 1941.